The Great BC Gold Rush began in 1898 when Clarence was 10, and Victoria began to fill up with gold seekers and those to meet their needs. So John Henry began to look westward for new real estate activity. He bought 300 acres on Oldfield Road without ever seeing it as an excellent building site. At this time, Clarence became infected with infantile paralysis, polio nowadays, and ordered to leave school. Remember, he's at boarding school in England, and to live an outdoor life. So John Henry suggested he come home and begin to clear the trees from the Vancouver Island property. This was most welcome to Clarence. He did not enjoy the English school, and it was impossible in those days to get home for holidays. So he circulated among Oldfield cousins in England instead. One summer he spent with his uncle, Henry Simpson, of Salter Simpson Auctioneers, where he gained an appreciation for farm animals and crops as they came up for sale. And another year he stayed with George Oldfield, who was managing Walter Oldfield's farm at Fulton Hall, and where he met Doris, his future wife. On hearing he must leave school, Clarence took a short course in prospecting at the London Polytechnic Institute, thinking that gold mining would be in his future. But although Prospect Lake was only a few miles away, and at the time there was a small operating gold mine in what is now Goldstream Park, farming was to become his life instead. So we've got Henry Clarence spending a summer with Uncle Henry Simpson of Salter Simpson Auctioneers. Now, his Aunt Louisa, remember that's his child, about 13 of the previous generation, she had married a Charles Edward Simpson. I'm not able to find a Henry Simpson, so it may be just the wrong first name in this document. But the name Salter also gets married into the family in another generation. Though the firm remained in Winnipeg, John Henry Oldfield became active in Victoria. He became agent for Crédit Foncier, a French company, who wished to develop a high-class housing estate in Victoria. And he acquired the Uplands Farm, which he began to lay out according to their wishes. It was an attractive development. All services were underground, and there were stringent regulations regarding the houses that could be built. It is still a desirable and fashionable area. Unfortunately, with the beginning of World War I, the French company was unable to transfer money from France. So John Henry Oldfield continued to develop it, selling lots in order to pay the taxes and expenses, until finally, in 1922, Crédit Foncier withdrew from the affair, and John Henry Oldfield continued to manage the development. John Henry formed a friendship with Samuel McClure, a well-known architect, who planned many of the Uplands home. And he began to plan Norfolk Lodge, the future Oldfield home, and one of 4 he designed for John Henry. Mrs. Oldfield and the family began the move from Winnipeg, living for a year in a house built by Mr. McClure on Pemberton Road, while Norfolk Lodge was under construction. K.J., known as Jack Oldfield, came from England to be involved in building the lodge, his sister Isabel coming with him, and their older sister Kitty coming at the close of the war with her husband, Bernard Edwards, a farm manager who managed Dr. O.M. Jones' lavender farm at Mechosen, and later the Miller Ranch at Rocky Point. These were brother and sisters of Doris Oldfield, who by now was married to Clarence Oldfield. So this is where we connect 2 branches of the Oldfield family by marriage. So we've got George Oldfield and his family. So firstborn, Alexander George, always known as Alex, born 1878. He was a bank clerk, I'll use the English pronunciation, a bank clerk. And at the time of his death, he left £6,000. That's about all I know about him. Number 2 is Kate, or Kitty, 1879. So she's the one who married Uncle Bernard, I'll call him, because that's what we always called him, and moved to Machosen and Rocky Point. Number 3, a daughter, Florence Sarah, born 1880. In 1911, I've come across her at the St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Florence Sarah was the Florence Nightingale of the family. Number 4, Gertrude, born 1882. She was christened and then died shortly after. 5, Bertha, born 1883. She married Mr. Abbott, and one of her children came out and was living at Brentwood Bay. I met Mike Abbott when I was growing up, and Bertha died in 1979 in Suffolk, but she only visited, and we've got her travel papers, but she never stayed in Canada. Child number 6, Isabella Mary, 1885, always known just as Isabel. She married Shirley Morgan Hobbs. Now, Shirley was a masculine name at that time. In 1911, she's the art mistress at Temple School, and the youngest daughter in the family, Jillian, is one of the students there. Now, Isabel did come out to Canada. So Isabel Hobbs, you may be familiar with her paintings, mostly of dogwoods. You may have seen her, they became quite well known, mostly about this size, beautiful paintings of dogwoods. And she actually was able to make a living through her art. So she was accomplished. Number 7 is Doris Octavia. Now, how can someone be named Octavia if they are the 7th child? So I think we are missing one. I have not been able to find another child born there. I don't know when there was time to have another one. Maybe 1883 between Gertrude and Bertha, maybe. Just time to squeeze one more in. Or between Florence and Gertrude, maybe. But yes, there we go. Isabella, Mary, and Doris. Yes. So maybe there was one more just before Doris. But she was named Doris Octavia, born 1889. So, do you recall the first Henry that we had up here? And the oldest one was Henry, and from this Henry we've got down to Henry Clarence Oldfield. George is the 11th child of the 13 children in that family. His daughter is Doris Octavia, born the same year as Henry Clarence. So because they're spread over 20 years, the older children have gained a generation already. So rather than being born in the same year and first cousins, they are first cousins once removed. Henry Clarence is a generation ahead of Doris, although they're born in the same year. So that's their genealogical relationship, is first cousins, but once removed. We've got Kenneth John. He's the builder who came out to help with building Norfolk Lodge. And then Jillian, born 1897. And she's got an unusual middle name. It's either Armour or Atmore. And she was born in Brighton. Why she was born in Brighton, I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. So that's for future fun. So by 1912, the Oldfields moved into Norfolk Lodge, which became a social center for Manitoba visitors and a busy place during the hunting season. Among them were Ted Weinerls and James Pt2, who had come out from Norfolk with John Henry to take up land many years ago. Many Winnipeg friends came out, including the lady whose entire career had been as receptionist clerk in the Winnipeg office, and many more business associates. Many would stay for days or weeks. At that time, the Saanich Municipal Game Farm raised over 5,000 pheasants, grouse, partridge, and quail every year for the hunting season. Prominent figures were invited if they came to Victoria. One of these was E. Cora Hind, the well-known financial editor of the Winnipeg Tribune, who had aggressively entered what was at that time the male preserve of business. She appeared in a well-tailored pinstriped suit. In the 1920s, the first woman I had seen wearing trousers. And following the 7-course dinner, when the cigars were handed out, she produced a small black cheroot, which was lighted by one of the men. And she went with the men into the living room instead of withdrawing with the ladies into the drawing room. Another less auspicious meeting was when Nellie McClung, fresh from her conquests in Manitoba and Alberta, came to live in her new home on Lantern Lane in Gordon Head. The Oldfield table was always set with tumblers and a large glass jug of water, but also with wine glasses, while decanters of red and white wine were set at opposite corners of the table. Mrs. McClung, however, was still breathing fire from her temperance crusades, and though she didn't take out her axe and chop the legs off the dining room table, she gave Mr. Oldfield a stern opinion of people who made liquor available to their guests and encouraged them to drink with their meals. As a result, the Oldfields lost interest in the McClungs. John Henry Oldfield made his own red wines, mostly cherry and plum. It was at this time that the Winnipeg winter holidays in Jamaica were now changed to the trips from Victoria to Japan. And for me, that sentence explains many of the artifacts that are in the beautiful curio cabinet that has been handed down through the Oldfields. There's much chinoiserie, Japanese items, lots of curios. So now we need the Henry Clarence Oldfield family. So Clarence, Henry Clarence was always known as H.C. or Clarence. Clarence Oldfield bought 30 acres of land between his father's property and Elk Lake and managed the large farm, which he called Norfolk Lodge Ranch, while John Henry Oldfield ran his real estate business from his office in the top floor gazebo or belvedere of Norfolk Lodge until his unfortunate accidental death in 1927. So the gentleman was checking on the pump house. Water was always a problem up at Norfolk Lodge. There was a well, which was always inadequate at any time of the year. They would collect the rainwater off the roof. They would keep that in cisterns, which they used for other than drinking water. They used the water from the cisterns. And John Henry was checking out the pump house when he had an accident which led to his death. So we've got the Oldfield family as we know them. So, well, not quite. We've got the firstborn. So they were married in 1912. The next year, Henry George was born, and he only lived for 17 hours. So an auspicious name, Henry George, but he didn't make it. Henry John Herbert is the one that we know as Herbert. He didn't use his two first names. Born 1914. Richard Clarence, my Uncle Dick, born 1915. Uncle Jim, I haven't got a birth date for him yet. No problem, I'll find it. And Edward, I didn't even know his name was Edward. He was always Uncle Toby. I never, ever, ever heard anybody call him Edward. It was always Uncle Toby, the baby of the family. And I've got a question mark up there, which B, you just might be interested, because I'm going to read an article from a local newspaper that doesn't have a year on it. RJH, initials of hospital baby. The Board of Directors of the Provincial Royal Jubilee Hospital last night were much interested to learn that the little daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Oldfield of Elk Lake, who was the first baby born in the new hospital, has been christened Ruth Joan Helen, her initials being the same as those of the hospital. The little girl was born on March the 18th, but what year? We don't know. I found no birth record for her in British Columbia. The first boy born at the hospital was George Norman Straith, son of Mr. and Mrs. George Straith, who came into the world on March 22. So it's a bit of a mystery that we hope to sort out. Now with the Oldfield family, the four boys survived. But what happened to the little girl? I don't know. Now we're at the end of Uncle Herbert's story of his family. He says, at this point, I should include a word about John Henry Oldfield's uncle, Walter Oldfield, who came to Canada a little earlier, and whose 17 children dispersed widely. Walter, I understand, returned to his English home at Folden Hall when his family at Springfield and Birds Hill, that's Manitoba, were grown. Now, as we shall see as we look at Walter Oldfield's family of 17 children, that sentence is not exactly factually accurate. So it was not 17 children who came to Canada. It was 13 at that point. So the first one we have Walter and his wife, Mary Jane Taylor. Mabel, the first one born. And this is another mystery that we need to solve, because when she was christened in 1876, clear as day, it says she was born in 1863. That's 3 years before her parents were born, and 3 years were married, and 3 years before their first child was born. So I don't know. I really don't know. That we'll have to sort out. Edith Mary, 1866. She lived to 1900. Third, Edmund. He's the one who married Ella Dessy in Suriname and wound up in Holland. Number 4, Horace Taylor, born in 1868. Horace Taylor is the father of Basil, Barbara, and Brian Oldfield, the family at Prospect Lake. So finally we're getting people that we know joining the family tree here. Number 5, now what a name, Whiffen Edgar. Whiffen. I can't even find it as a surname. Born 1870. He came to Manitoba in 1881, so all these kids that were born by that time, they show up on the 1881 census in Manitoba, including Whiff and Edgar, and then he drops from the scene. I don't know what happened to him. Ida Amelia, born 1871, still alive in 1868. She participated in the Boer War as a nurse. Child number 7, Frank, he died in the Boer War. So his sister was a nurse, he was killed. Number 8, Arthur, born 1873, can't find him. Nora, number 9, born in 1874, I can't find Nora. Number 10, Lewis, 1875, I don't know where he went to. Number 11, Beatrice, born 1877. She married an Edward Ashwood and had a child. Number 12, Mabel. Remember, this is the second Mabel. We've already had one who obviously was already dead by 1879 when the second Mabel was born. She married an Ernest Cottrell. Number 13 is Elsie. Born 1880, she married a Berriage Grenville George Dupas in 1900. And now number 14, Helen Maud, she was born 1882 in Manitoba. The next one, William Septimus. Septimus, he was the 7th boy in the family, born 1883 in Manitoba. He married Christine Connor and died here in Esquimalt in 1964. Ruth, born Ashel, so now back in 1885, they're back in England. Another baby born, Ruth, born at Ashel, and the final one, Reginald, born in 1886. So a lot that I have not been able to account for. I don't know if they died or if they just simply part of the Oldfield diaspora. I do not know. I do not know. So these are his comments, Herbert's comments about the family we've just seen. So Edith Mary married Richard Mason Palmer, who became provincial horticulturist for BC and later for the Dominion of Canada. They lived at Lake Hill and later in Cobble Hill, where he bred gladioli. His son Dick managed the Summerland experimental farm in the 1920s. Then second child Edmund, he's the one who went to Suriname to manage the sugar plantation and retired to Holland. Horace, and this is the one who fathered our family of Prospect Lake Oldfields. Horace went to New Zealand, I believe, and then returned to live at Prospect Lake. He married Mildred James, whose father, Percy James, was influential in founding St. Columba's Church at Strawberry Vale. His sons, Basil and Brian, started and ran the Oldfield Service Station on West Saanich Road. Ida was matron of a field hospital in South Africa during the Boer War. I met her in England when she was 97. Frank went to South Africa, where he died in the Boer War. Arthur went to Egypt. Lewis took up land in the USA. Beatrice married Edward Ashwood of Vineland, BC. Helen married Reg Mace of Vancouver. William married Christine O'Connor, which is Christine Connor, and lived at Duncan and Victoria. His son Bill lives on Piers Island. So that's the end of what Herbert Oldfield had to say about his family back in 2005. Now for me, I have one closing comment. It's where Belford is writing in the Daily Colonist, And she said that the Oldfield family can be found in Canada, the US, Zululand, New Zealand, Australia, virtually around the world. She said that an Oldfield from British Columbia could virtually travel to any country and sit down to a meal with one of his relatives. And I believe that's probably not too far off the mark. I had a strange feeling at one point in the research when one of the children of one of these generations married someone with the surname Piper in Suffolk, in one of the towns where I have Pipers in my genealogy. And I thought, uh-oh, Susan, you keep up with this, you're going to find you're related to yourself. You're going to find you're your own 64th cousin 3 times removed. That's what it's like with genealogy. You don't know what you're going to find, but it's a wonderful ride. It's a wonderful ride. Now, I do want to thank some sources or acknowledge them, including the Prospect Lake Historical Society, the Saanich Archives, the Saanich Pioneers Society Archives, Victoria Genealogical Society and their Resource Center, FamilySearch.org, the LDS Family History Center, Ancestry.com, Vital Statistics BC, the Daily Colonist, the Victoria Times, and I gratefully acknowledge all of the Oldfield ancestors, all of our ancestors, and I'm thankful for their stories and their lives. Thank you. Thank you. So back to the quiz. We now know it's Caldecott Road. We now know it was named after where John Henry, the developer, where he lived. Norfolk Lodge, Samuel McClure. And he also designed Sunny Hill across the road. The other questions, what names would you not want to have?
Herbert.
You don't want to be a Herbert, and you don't want to be an Edmund. But you want to be Henry, you want to be the firstborn. Yeah. Is that all of the questions that were on the quiz? I think so. I think we're done. But I'll be around for a little while, if people have questions.
You've had difficulty getting info on the more recent relatives, but the past ones are so available. What's going on there?
Okay, one reason is privacy legislation. So on Vital Statistics BC, you can get deaths up to 1992, but you can only get marriages up to 1915, and births only up to, I think it's 1908, something like that. No? A bit later. I don't know. But because of privacy legislation, you can only get the censuses up to 1911, and just in about a week they're going to release the 1921 censuses, and all the genealogists, and they're going to crash some sites, they really are, because everyone's just waiting for the 1921 census to see where all these people that we had pinned down in 1911, what have they been doing for the next 10 years? There's going to be a feeding frenzy. But that's part of it, Joanne.
Yeah.
Yeah.